So this morning we're starting this new series called Blood and Thunder. And the point of it is that we're asking kind of a big question. What does it take to see a move of God? And I want to propose to you guys a very simple recipe. It is blood and thunder. So when we talk about thunder, what are we talking about? We're talking about a picture in Scripture of God's power, like the hand of God, the divine touch, God's glory. And one of the most famous examples of this would be on Mount Sinai. So when Moses is there and they're receiving the Ten Commandments, they're given, thunder is involved. So it says in Exodus, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled in fear. They stayed at a distance. And certainly I think we can understand that, because can you imagine that moment? Can you imagine the awe that they must have felt of God in that moment? This is the kind of like at the beginning of the redemption story. And then we see thunder in the very end as well. In the book of Revelation, John describes the glory of God that is to come, and he writes this. He says, "From the throne came flashes of lightning, rumblings and peals of thunder. In front of the throne, 7 lamps were blazing. These are the 7 spirits of God." So thunder is used, obviously, in the Bible, both literally, but also as hyperbole. And it's understandable why. Because if you have ever been in the middle of a thunderstorm, if you've ever been, there is something that, like, if you're close to it, right, it demands your attention. There's something inside all of us that just responds to the rumble of thunder. Thunder has this way of reminding us that we're pretty small, that we're human, that we don't control very much, and we certainly don't manufacture thunder. There's kind of a mystery to the occurrence of thunder. And so for the sake of this series, thunder is the equivalent to what only God can do. Okay, what only God can do. It stands for what's outside of us, outside of our capabilities. Because one thing is clear in Scripture, and it's that God is a lot bigger than we are. He's eternal. He's all-powerful. He's present everywhere. He's the Alpha and Omega. He's the beginning and the end. So that's thunder. Okay, what's the blood? Well, blood in Scripture is a picture of sacrifice. Blood is a picture of life. It says in Leviticus, for the life of a creature is in the blood. And in the New Testament, Christian service is often described as a sacrifice. In the Old Testament, they would very, very literally sacrifice animals. They would spill their blood, right, as an offering to God. And all of that pointed forward to the eventual sacrifice of Jesus. And so after the sacrifice of Jesus, we don't offer animals to God anymore. We no longer shed the blood of animals. Instead, Jesus' followers are invited to become what Paul called living sacrifices. That we are to live in such a way that our entire lives glorify God. Paul writes this, he says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy," and to this point in the book of Romans, he has just explained all that Jesus has done for us. "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." So we don't throw our bodies on an altar and shed our own blood. Instead, Paul is saying we offer our entire lives to God in gratitude, in worship. We say to God, "Father, in response to what you have done for me in Christ, in response to your goodness and your love for me, I want to offer you my entire life as a sacrifice back to you. Everything that I have, everything that I am, it's yours. I'm yours. Okay? My life is a living sacrifice." So in this series, blood equals what God asks us to do. What God asks us to do. And I believe that when you take those two elements, blood and thunder, so you take what only God can do, and then you mix it with what we are all called to do. And when those two things come together, it's powerful. As long as both are present, it's powerful. So blood plus thunder equals a move of God. But what so often happens, and I think we've all seen this in Christians and we've seen it in ourselves, what so often happens is people focus on one of these to the exclusion of the other. Some people behave as if, it's just all about God. It's all about God's power. It's about his sovereignty. It's about him doing what he does. And so I'm just going to sit around and do nothing and let God do the God thing. I'm going to trust that God's going to do something majestic, but I'm just going to let go and let God. I don't have to give any effort. I don't have to work for this. I don't have to be involved in this in any way. I'm just going to let God do it. And then nothing seems to happen. And we find ourselves kind of disappointed because it is all thunder and no blood. On the other hand, some people live as if it's all up to me. And they work and they strive and they clamor and they effort and they endeavor. But there's no prayer. There's no worship. There's no sense that I need God. We need God. This situation needs God. And lo and behold, the results are very human. They're very natural. So there's a lot of blood, but there's no thunder. And in the end, it lacks the supernatural. See, here's the thing. I think God is inviting every one of us into a supernatural journey. Like a supernatural journey. He's inviting every one of us to walk with him and to embrace the mission that he's giving to us, to be used by him to leave a unique imprint on this world. And I think he longs to bring thunder if we're willing to offer him the blood, if we work and we sacrifice for the mission that he gives us. And so today, I want us to think about the allure of what we might call our shadow mission. So here's the idea. We're all created by God for a mission, for something unique and special. But if we don't embrace our God-given mission, we can then allow our lives to kind of deteriorate slowly into something kind of selfish, something kind of trivial, self-absorbed. And we might call that our shadow mission. And so we're going to kick this series off today with one of my favorite stories of all time in the Bible, the story of Esther. And it's the story out of the Old Testament with several characters that are given a choice between a mission and a shadow mission. Will they embrace what God has called them to do, or will they deteriorate into pursuing something else? And so let me set this story up a little bit, give you a little context. The book of Esther is set in the capital of Persia named Susa. And it's a story about Jews that have been taken from their home in Israel, and they are living in Persia as exiles, in this foreign land. Now, the story of Esther spans 10 chapters, so obviously we're going to cover the whole thing today, but I'm going to summarize sweeping chunks of it because you don't want to be here until midnight. But the author kind of sets the stage for this, and rather than me explaining it, I want to just read it to you. And as I read the introduction to the story, I want you to try to visualize the scene. Really picture in your mind what's being described. What is the king that's being described like? What is his kingdom like? What are the things that are important to him? So here we go. This is Esther chapter 1. It's the first 9 verses, and this kind of sets the stage. It says, "This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant. in keeping with the king's liberality. But by the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. So the author is trying to paint the picture and set the scene. He wants us to understand, or she wants us to understand, that King Xerxes was unbelievably powerful. That this kingdom was massive, 127 provinces. Okay, so King Xerxes was by far the most, in his day, the most powerful man in the world. And we are to understand that he's a guy that loves to party. In just the first 9 verses of this story, we see 3 huge parties. The first one involves all of his nobles and officials, and it lasts, does anybody remember how long? 180 days. That's a party. 180 days. Think of that, 180 days of endless partying. I don't even know what to compare to that. It's like maybe a couple of semesters at Wazoo. Okay, 180 days, unrestrained partying. And then when that's over, what does he do? He throws another huge bash. It's a 7-day rager, and this time the entire capital city is involved, all of Susa. Xerxes wants everyone to be aware of his immense wealth. He's showing off. And this party gets described, of course, in elaborate detail. The writer goes to great lengths to show how extravagant it all was. There's couches of gold and silver and mosaic pavement, and there's pillars of marble and these exquisite tapestries, and everyone is drinking wine from golden goblets. Imagine that. And every goblet, we're told, was unique. This is expensive stuff. And we're told the drinking was unrestrained. I mean, the king has essentially turned the capital into like Animal House. And while all this is going on, the Queen Vashti, was throwing a nice little soiree for her lady friends. And it says in verse 10, on the 7th day of all of this, when the king was in high spirits from wine, I don't know what that means, but he sends for Queen Vashti. So he's been showing off all of his possessions all week long, and now he wants to show off his ultimate possession. And what do you guess he wanted the people to notice about Queen Vashti? You think it was her intellect? Did he call her in to challenge her with difficult math problems? Well, it says in verse 11, he called her in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. And then a shocking thing happens. Vashti says, no. Come parade myself before a mob of good old boys after 7 days of Miller time? I don't think so. I don't think so. And so now what does the king do? How does he respond? Does he say, oh, shoot, you're right, sweetheart. That was insensitive of me. How awkward for you. I never should have suggested it. You know, that was downright chauvinistic. Please forgive me, honey. Yeah, not so much. It says, the king became furious and burned with anger. Why? Because this struck at his sense of power and dominance and control and image. It made him look weak. It ate away at his image. It ate away at his shadow mission. This is what his life is all about. So, since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times. Now, the writer wants us to kind of catch the irony of all of this. The most powerful guy in the world can't control his wife. So he goes to their version of the Supreme Court. And he makes it a matter of state. And he's like, guys, what am I going to do with my wife? She won't listen. So check out the response of his advisors. This is awesome. Brilliant men. Queen Vashti has done wrong, they say, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, And so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end to the disrespect and discord. King, if you don't get a handle on your wife, we're all in trouble. The wives are going to rebel all over the kingdom. They go on. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. I'm sure she's going to be really bummed about that. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest. Yeah, that'll happen. And part of what's happening in the story is the writer is showing us what ridiculous brown-nosers the king's advisors are. I mean, they say to him, let this edict be proclaimed throughout your vast realm. Your kingdom is enormous, O king. Okay, like you demand, Xerxes. So the king has surrounded himself with people, and this is something that we're all tempted to do. The king has surrounded himself with people that will reinforce his shadow mission. And so the king thinks, that's a good idea, guys. That's what I'm going to do. And he does. But when the king sobers up after the 7-day rager and his anger subsides, he realizes, shoot, I don't got a queen. Man, I got to get me a new queen. So he's advised by his personal attendants on how to go about this. Now, these are not the Supreme Court advisors. These are young guys. These are high testosterone young men who give him their idea of how to go about finding a new queen and what to look for. Anybody want to guess what their number one trait would be? Looks. King, you need to get you a hot wife. So they suggest that what he do is he hold a Miss Medes and Persians beauty contest. And they suggest that every province in the kingdom offers to the royal harem the best looking woman in that province. Anybody remember how many provinces there were in his kingdom? 127. And in the end, they say the girl that pleases the king, the girl who really makes the king's head turn and go, wow, she will then become the ultimate trophy wife. Okay, the new queen. Now, I know that, part of this, you read these ancient stories, and I know it's hard for us to believe in our day that there was once a culture so superficial that middle-aged men would try to impress people by showing how much wealth and power they have so that they could attract a wife of youth and beauty. We cannot fathom such a culture, but there once was. So that's what the king does. And one of the contestants is a young Jewish girl named Esther. She's an orphan girl. She's lost her father and her mother, and she was taken in and raised by her cousin Mordecai. And they have this very tender relationship. And we're going to come back to Mordecai later in the story. We're told Esther had a lovely figure, and she was beautiful. And so she makes it through the prelims. She's one of the finalists that's selected to go before the king. Now, I want to set this up a little bit because this is a big deal. This preparation to go before the king is such a big deal. This is not a casual thing. This is like the date of a lifetime. So I just have a few questions about dating for some of our women folk. And just a little bit of honesty time. I want you to think about the amount of time that you would maybe spend preparing for a date. So bathing, hair, makeup, wardrobe selection, manicure, pedi, accessories, perfume. I don't know what you guys do. I mean, I'm married and I still don't know what you guys do. But just be honest for a second, okay? How many of you have ever spent more than an hour prepping for a date? Okay, yeah. Okay. How many of you ever spent more time getting ready for the date than you actually spent on the date itself? So, okay, yeah, it's honestly. How many of you actually had more fun getting ready than you? Okay. So here's the prep time for Esther for her first date. This is awesome. Check this out. It says, before a young woman's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. That's a lot of pressure for a first date, don't you think? I mean, if somebody's not into you after 12 months of prepping, it's probably not going to work out. But Esther is like jaw-dropping. She's like eye-poppingly beautiful. And she is chosen as the new queen. Her apparent mission was to be eye candy for the most powerful man on earth and to enjoy the luxury of palace life. So the king throws another party, of course, and Esther lives happily ever after, right? Well, there's another character in this story, and his name is Haman. He's King Xerxes' right-hand man, chief of staff. And he's a much stronger, more dictatorial leader than Xerxes. But Haman also has a shadow mission. Haman has this insatiable appetite for being praised and glorified. You ever known somebody like that? In fact, there's something that kind of keeps him up at night. All the king's nobles bow down and they worship Haman except one. There's one guy that won't do it, and it's driving him crazy. And it just so happens to be Esther's cousin, Mordecai. Mordecai's job was that he was stationed at the city gate, which meant that he was one of the royal officials. In fact, he had once discovered a plot. As a part of this, they would hear a lot of what was going on in the city. He discovered a plot to assassinate the king, and he exposed it, and he saved King Xerxes' life. So Esther's cousin Mordecai is kind of a big deal. But he refuses to bow down to Haman. So check this out. We're told, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom. So he goes to Xerxes, and he asks Xerxes to issue a royal decree to not only kill Mordecai, but all of Mordecai's people, all of the Jews. Genocide throughout the kingdom. Now, the king doesn't really care about justice. He doesn't even know what people Haman is talking about. He doesn't even realize that he's talking about Mordecai. So he thoughtlessly issues the decree. Now, Mordecai, he hears about the decree, and you have to imagine the terror and horror that he's feeling. So he sends word back to his cousin, Esther. He's like, you have to go to the king, and you have to change his mind. But Esther is reluctant. And here's why. She explains to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned by the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. So Esther is like, look, Mordecai, you don't just barge into the royal chambers whenever you feel like it to talk to the king. You have to be invited. You have to be summoned. You only talk to the king at his request. Anything else is punishable by death. So unless he happens to extend the gold scepter when he sees you, if you barge into the king, you die. And she says, even as queen, I have to be summoned. And Mordecai, you need to know, he hasn't called on me for more than 30 days. 30 days. And she's like, guess what? I'm not naive. I know he's got a very full harem of young, beautiful women, and he's not a one-woman kind of guy. And apparently, he's not as into me as he was at first. So you want me to barge into the king's chambers and tell him that he's made a mistake that he doesn't know how to rule his kingdom, like that's suicide. Now, upon getting a response like that, most of us would back off, be like, oh, okay, yeah, They'd say to Esther, okay, I understand, I get it, never mind, don't do it. But not Mordecai. He's going to push back, he's going to challenge her. He tells her, listen, there is way too much on the line for you to not go. He reminds her of what will happen unless she does something. And then he reminds her that their life is no accident, that God is with her, that God has orchestrated her life, that God has a mission for her. And here's what he says. It ends with this. He says, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Esther, the fate of the whole nation is in your hands. You didn't ask for this responsibility, but here it is. Esther, you've not been brought to this point in your life for the sake of accumulating an exquisite wardrobe or precious gems or exotic fragrances. Esther, you've been brought to this point in your life just to be, you haven't been brought to this point in your life just to become the most desirable and attractive woman in the whole kingdom. You've been brought to this point in your life to be a part of what it is that God is doing to redeem the world. So don't let your success at filling society's stereotype for women blind you to what God says your life is actually all about. Don't be diverted by a shadow mission. And Mordecai replies back to her and helps her discern God's calling in her life. And he issues her a very strong challenge. He says, Esther, if you say no here, if you miss this, as frightening as it is, you may miss the very reason that you are on the planet. Who knows but that you have come to your position for such a time as this? This is your moment, Esther. This is it. Don't miss it. And Esther says, you're right. But I cannot do this on my own. I need God to move. Okay, I'll offer my blood. I'll take the risk. I'll offer everything. But I need God to bring the thunder. So she sends word back to Mordecai. And check out her faith and courage. This is awesome. This is such a great story. She says, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. What a courageous statement of purpose and faith. I will not allow my life to deteriorate into a pursuit of comfort and elegance. There's too much at stake. And so as hard and as terrifying as this is my calling. So I will risk my life. I will go to the king. And if I perish, I perish. Now, a move of God, as we're talking about and as we will continue to look at, a move of God requires power from above. But God is also asking us to contribute human tears and sweat and blood. It requires effort and risk and a willingness to sacrifice. It's blood plus thunder that equals a move of God. And in this dire situation in Persia, facing genocide, there was a whole lot of prayer. Right? Esther is fasting and praying. Mordecai is fasting and praying. The Jews throughout the entire kingdom are fasting and praying. Esther says she's even making her maids and her servants pray. I mean, you think about that. They probably weren't even believers. Right? I mean, this is Persia. They're probably Persian ladies. They're not even Jewish. And she's like, oh, you will pray. I'm the queen. Pray right now. And they're like, Queen Esther, we're hungry. We're hungry. And she's like, fast. You will fast. You don't eat. Don't. Right? And what is it that they are fasting and praying for? They're fasting and praying for God to do what only God can do. Ever been there? You need God to do what only God can do. And it's interesting because throughout history, when God's people are desperate for him to move, when they truly are brought to a place where they're desperate for him to move, not only do they pray, but they fast. And in the case of Esther and her people, we're told it was 3 days. Now, before Jesus started his ministry, he went into the wilderness to pray and what? And fast. Anybody remember how long he prayed and fasted? 40 days. 40 days. 40 days. Now, I could probably recount like example after example after example from the Bible of God's people praying and fasting. And yet, I just have to tell you, I just want to confess this, and this is in all seriousness. I'm embarrassed to tell you, but I have, as a leader and a pastor, totally dropped the ball on this. I have myself almost completely neglected the practice of fasting, and certainly it's not something that I've helped us do as a church, as a community. And I believe that as a church, we are entering into a critical time in our history as a community of God's people together. And we are entering, in a way, a sort of for such a time as this, kind of season or moment. And we have the opportunity, as many of you have been aware for a while, we have the opportunity to purchase this building, to make it our own, to make this place ours for good. But more than that, this is a time, I think, and a season for us to really think about who we are, what God has called us to do and to be together. And so as a part of this season, as a leadership team, as we've thought about what this might look like, we want to pray like we have never prayed before, which means we want to pray and, guess what? Fast. And so I reached out to John and Andrea Fan, and I asked them to sort of lead our church through 40 days of prayer and fasting. Now, Jesus fasted for 40 days. I can't imagine that. We're not asking any person to fast for 40 days. Some of you are like, well, the scale's been, Yes, the holidays, they're not kind, but 40 days, we're not asking you to do that. No, we're not asking any person to do that. But as a community, as a church, we can certainly do 40 days, okay, if we divide it up. And so what we're asking you guys each to consider is to take one day of that 40-day period, to take one day to fast and to pray. And we have a calendar in the foyer. Some of you may have noticed it on the way in. And our hope is that not only do we cover every single day, but that on most of those days, there would be multiple people that would be fasting and praying for God to move among us. So it would be a 24-hour fast, not 40 days, which means that here's how it would work. You eat dinner like normal, and then you don't eat again until the next dinner. Okay, so you're basically skipping breakfast and lunch. And then during the day, when you would be normally eating, you spend time doing what do you think? Praying. Or when you recognize that you're hungry because your body may remind you that you're hungry, then you take that as a reminder to pray. And so today, John and Andrea are going to be in the foyer after the service, and we have like a handout for, guidelines of here's how you do a 24-hour fast. And John and Andrea will be back there, and they can answer all kinds of questions that you might have, medical, nutritional questions, that kind of stuff. But guys, I really, really, really believe that if we ask God to bring thunder, like really, really ask for it, to do what only He can do in our lives and in our church, and we're going to be praying for all kinds of stuff. I mean, we're asking you guys to jot down the biggest things in your life or the life of those that you love, and we're going to pray for that stuff too. I mean, stuff that we really need the thunder for. But I believe that if we do that, if we really pray and we really seek Him on this, God might just blow our minds. And God just has a history of doing this. Okay, back to Esther. Esther and Mordecai and all the Jews in this city, they fast and they pray. But it isn't just about the prayer and the fasting. Esther makes this astounding statement. She says, after 3 days, I will go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. And she's making an unbelievable declaration. She's saying, I am willing to do my part. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'm willing to put myself out there. I'm willing to give everything I have. Okay, I'm willing to give everything that I have flowing through my veins and my arteries and my capillaries in order to see God's will done. I'm willing to do whatever I can in the hopes of seeing God do what only He can do. And so that the results would not be natural, but they would be supernatural. So Esther fasts and she prays along with all of her people, okay, all the Jews in the whole kingdom for 3 days. And then after that, she goes uninvited to the king. And so you have to imagine the turmoil and the angst that she is facing as she's in this moment. She stands in the king's inner court and she waits, like her heart in her throat, life or death in the balance. And she sees the king and he sees her, and he reaches out his golden scepter. And she's going to live, at least for the moment. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." This is going really well so far. Like, she's got to be going, all the praying and fasting seems to be paying off. But I don't want to oversell what's happening here, because we have to understand that culture a little bit. This is really like king talk for, what is it you want? I'm in a pretty good mood today. I mean, if Esther had said, oh, okay, cool, I'll take half the kingdom, his tone would have changed real fast. What he's saying is more along the lines of, Esther, would you like to be in charge of the remote tonight? Okay, so she can't just like come out and say, in this moment, I'd like to have you revoke the unalterable law of the Medes and the Persians and put down your chief of staff. So what she says is, this is brilliant. She says, I'm having a party. I want you to come. And bring Haman too. Like, Esther is awesome. She's just got street smarts. And she knows this king. She knows that this king has never turned down a party in his life. And so the king and Haman, they go to her party, they go to her banquet, and they're having a great time. And again, the king comes to Esther. He's like, I know there's more than just me coming to your party. And so he goes to Esther and asks what she wants. It says, as they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now what is your petition? It will be given to you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. And she's just crafting the scenario. She's just building the interest in this thing. Because by coming to the second banquet and acknowledging again his favor of Esther, the king is almost already agreeing to whatever it is that she's going to ask. And now we're ready for the apex of this story, but not quite yet. The author is going to kind of leave us in suspense for what's going to happen, and he switches back to focus on Haman for a second. And this is awesome. It says, Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai at the king's gate. So Haman had the shadow mission that so many people in our culture have. And it's called more. You think about all that he had. It's ridiculous. But he had the shadow mission of more. Needed more wealth, more power, more success, more applause. Just more. And the problem with the shadow mission of more is that it's never enough. Enough is never enough. In fact, one of the most obvious signs that you're living for a shadow mission is the chronic sense of emptiness. Because the thing is, shadows, they never satisfy. Now, do Haman's wife and friends recognize this in him and speak truth into his life? Do they say, Haman, your trouble stems from being an egomaniac? Okay, if you were to shift your focus from how the kingdom can serve you to how you can serve the people of the kingdom, you might find joy and goodness and satisfaction and fulfillment beyond your wildest dreams. Do they tell him the truth in love? No. They just play to his ego. Chapter 5, verse 14, it says, his wife Zeresh and all her friends said to him, here's what you should do. Have a pole set up reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. And it says, this suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. So Haman has a gallows that's built 75 feet high. And you go, 75 feet high? That's high. Why so high? Well, because he doesn't just want Mordecai executed. He wants everyone to see it. He wants this to be public humiliation. Then the story shifts back to the king. We're told that night, Xerxes can't sleep. He's got insomnia. And so the king asks his servants to come in and read to him from a book. You'll never guess the name of the book. It's a book called The Chronicles of the King. Guess what the book is about? The king. He's like, guys, I can't sleep. Maybe we should read something. And I'm like, what should we read? He says, how about that book about me? And like his preoccupation with himself is just limitless. And as they're reading about the king, they read about this guy. They happen to read about this guy named Mordecai, about how one time he exposed a plot to assassinate King Xerxes. And suddenly, as they're reading, Xerxes thinks, you know what? Mordecai was never properly honored or thanked for what he did for me. We should do something for Mordecai. The next thing that happens is Haman shows up. Now, he doesn't know about the king's reading, and here's what happens. When Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now, Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Brilliant. And the king says, hey, that's a great idea. That's a fantastic idea. So imagine this moment. He's like, that's a great idea, Haman. The man I delight to honor is Mordecai. You pull the horse. And from here, right, it is all downhill for Haman. And he parades Mordecai through the streets. And Esther holds the banquet that night. And now the time is right, and so she tells the king the story about her desperate situation, about the plot to destroy Mordecai and all of her people. And she reminds the king that his edict still stands. And the king says, who would do such a horrible thing to you and your people? And she looks across the table and points and says, this wicked man, Haman. And Haman ends up hanged on the gallows he built for Mordecai. Mordecai then gets appointed as the new chief of staff. The king reverses his edict to kill the Jews and instead makes an edict that all of the Jews and all of the kingdom are to be highly honored. And we're told, and this is unbelievable, that people all over the land committed themselves to the God of the Israelites. All because one man was willing to name reality to a young woman. Perhaps you have come to your position for such a time as this. And one woman said no to a shadow mission of safety and security and wealth and status, and yes to following God, even at the risk of her own life. And now here we are. It's our day. And you are where you are. And you've been given what you've been given for a reason. And of course, the bad news is every one of us is tempted to pursue a shadow mission. But the good news is, and this is really good news, Jesus understands. Jesus knows what it is to be tempted. I mean, if you really think about it, Jesus faced a very big shadow mission of his own. For Jesus, his shadow mission was to be the Messiah, to wear the crown without the suffering and without the cross. There's a great New Testament scholar named F.F. Bruce, and he wrote this. He said, "Time and time again, the temptation came to Jesus from many directions to choose some less costly way of fulfilling the calling than the way of suffering and death, but he resisted it to the end." And you think about it, and that is so true. During his 40 days of fasting and prayer that we already talked about this morning, during that time at the very beginning, we're told that Satan comes to tempt him. Satan comes and says to him, hey, you can be Messiah on a mission without hunger. Just turn these stones to bread. You can do it without pain. Just throw yourself down and the angels will lift you up. You can do it without opposition. Bow before me and I'll give you all the kingdoms of this earth. Be king with no suffering, without any cost. And later on, when Jesus tells the disciples that he's going to have to suffer and die. Remember, Peter pulls him aside and he says, Jesus, don't talk like that. That doesn't have to happen. That should never have to happen. You don't have to suffer. You don't have to die. And what does Jesus say to Peter? Get behind me, who? Satan. Why? Because Jesus had heard that before. Jesus faced this shadow mission again and again and again and again. You think about his words as he's agonizing in prayer in the garden. Father, take this cup of suffering from me. Father, take this cup of suffering from me. Father, take this cup of suffering from me. But he concedes, Father, not my will, but yours be done. Okay, your mission, not the shadow mission. Your mission, not the shadow mission. The one that we follow understands the struggle. And the truth is, all of our lives are a part of a much bigger story. And we don't get to see how God is working behind the scenes. So often we just don't see, we don't know. And this is what's going on in the story of Esther. It's pretty awesome. I don't know if you knew this, but Esther is actually the only book in the Bible, in the entire Bible, that never mentions the word God. And I think it's for a reason. I think it's because, as is often the case in our lives, God is hiding in the story of Esther just off stage. You can't see him, but he's actually behind the whole story. I mean, when you think about it, how is it that all of the women in the empire, of all the women in the empire, a Jewish girl named Esther is the one that becomes queen? How is it that of all the men in the royal guard, it's Mordecai that saves the king from assassination? How is it that the king should have insomnia on the very night that Haman builds a gallows for Mordecai? How is it that of all the stories, the one read to the king that night was the one about Mordecai saving his life? How is it that the scheming murderer somehow becomes the victim of his own schemes? How is it that Mordecai takes over Haman's old position? How is it that instead of being killed in a massive genocide, the people of Israel become a great light that draws multitudes of foreign people to God? And the writer wants us to understand that in unseen, unnamed ways, on crosses, and in carpools, and in cubicles, and in classrooms and on construction sites. God is present. God is always present. And God is at work, often behind the scenes in ways that we cannot see. And so I just want to close by reminding you that you are where you are for a reason. You are where you are for a reason. And you have what you have for a reason. You've been given what you've been given for a reason. And perhaps you've come to your position for such a time as this. And so what's God calling you to do, and what is God calling you to be wherever you are? Because whatever that is, you don't want to trade it for anything else.